Okay, so I'll continue with the podcast. We got halfway through this particular extract from Kershaw's book, so I'm just going to jump straight to where we were. The highlighting from the first podcast isn't on this second podcast up to the halfway point. You'll have to revisit the first podcast if you want to review that highlighting. We got down to the threat from the right. Okay, so we reached a point where Kershaw had been talking about the fact that the threat from the extreme left was sustained, although it didn't disappear in 1919 to 20. In fact, with the reparations issue, that sort of bugbear of communism kept reappearing, particularly in places like Saxony and Thuringia, which in each instance was put down by the extreme right. So the Aber-Gruner Pact was sort of reaping rewards, but the issue of the threat from the extreme left hadn't gone away. So Kershaw sort of picks up the theme then, that what this basically did is it resulted in polarisation. The genuine fear of a communist revolution was now something that was permanent. It hadn't gone away. And as a result, the middle classes in particular began to move over to the extreme right. So the extreme right were not just simply the prop that's going to defend the Republic. Effectively, they are now potentially an opposition to the Republic as well. So the first point, in spite of the fact that the far right was a prop to the Republic, the Aber-Gruner Pact, their support was purely pragmatic and temporary. The motivations of the extreme right, whether it's conservative or radical, was very anti-democratic. They were not pro-Republican, okay? Even though they are supporting the Republic, the reason they're doing that is a negative reason. They're doing it because they share with the Republic hostility to the far left. But that's a sort of negative bind to the Republic. It is not. They're not supporting the Republic because they support democracy. They are anti-democratic. So at heart, the far right were anti-democratic, and they despised the Republic. And those feelings of hostility towards the Republic are now getting worse. You can see those attitudes periodically bubbling away beneath the surface in the years 1920-22. So during this period in which they are supposed to be supporting the Republic, you can see that sort of hostility constantly simmering away. Now, the obvious example is the Cat Putsch of March 1920, where there was an attempt to seize power. But the other thing, of course, is the right-wing terrorist groups. There were 352 political murders between 1919 and 1922. That's murders against Republican politicians and also left-wing politicians. But nevertheless, it shows the readiness of the right-wing to resort to violence, to move outside normal politics to make their point. So 1923 then became a crisis year for the Republic, as you know. It was initiated by the French invasion of the Ruhr when Germany defaulted on reparation payments. Ultimately, it was the year of the hyperinflation, which destroyed the currency, and with it, it wiped out the savings of the middle classes. And as a result, any previous inclination of the extreme right to defend the Republic, which was at best tenuous, now began to seriously weaken in 1923. Those anti-democratic tendencies, which are bubbling beneath the surface, are now becoming much more open, much more overt, more dangerous. And no more so than in Bavaria in the south. So let's revisit Bavaria. Okay, this is where Kershaw has become very strong. Bavaria in particular was, to say, a haven, a greenhouse for anti-democratic nationalists. Okay, so e.g., and a good example of this, not seen this mentioned in the textbooks, so it's worthwhile mentioning. In 1922, the government in Berlin passed a law for the protection of the Republic. It was passed by the Reichstag in Berlin. It required the individual states to combat political extremism and violence, and yet the Bavarian state government, led by Gustav von Kahr, refused to implement that law. In Bavaria, General Ludendorff, the old co-leader of the OHL during World War I, had become the symbolic figure for all of those paramilitary groups that were combining and gathering in Bavaria, and Hitler was increasingly emerging as their spokesman, urging a march on Berlin. However, those paramilitaries gathering in Bavaria, the right-wing sort of ex-Freikorps gathering in Bavaria, needed the support of the national German army, the Reichswehr, if they were to succeed in toppling the government in Berlin. So it comes now down to the army leadership. Okay, what was their attitude towards the Republic? Now, the commander-in-chief, the head of the Reichswehr, was General von Seeckt. Okay, so he's the key person to mention. The army leadership, as we know, showed no enthusiasm for the Republic, for the new democracy. It refused to intervene to restore order in Bavaria. Okay, earlier in 1920, it had stood by and watched Kapp take control in Berlin. Now, it hadn't supported Kapp, but it likewise had refused to intervene. Now, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, you've got similar threat emerging from the south in Bavaria. Will the Bavarian authorities gather these paramilitary groups and march north on Berlin, as Kapp had done in 1920? And you sort of see the similar sort of trends. The army, whose job it was to protect Berlin, is refusing to intervene. Okay, in spite of the fact that the Bavarian state government was blatantly refusing to follow the lead of the Berlin government. On the other hand, okay, you can't go so far as to say that the army was blatantly throwing themselves in and supporting the potential rebels. It continued to support the Berlin government, quote Kershaw, in the abstract. It's tolerant of the new democracy. So, for example, Seeckt warned the Bavarian political leaders, okay, and the political leaders were Gustav von Kahr, the head of the government, and the leader of the Bavarian police, Seisser, against being pushed into action by these extremist paramilitary groups that are gathering in their state, led by Hitler. So there was a clear warning by Seeckt, you mustn't be pushed into action. We are the elites. We are the establishment. We decide. Now, in this sense, if you go back down to Bavaria, the local army leadership in Bavaria, it becomes important, because the local army, the army based in the state of Bavaria, was led by this man Lossow. Okay, now he initially favoured Hitler's call to march on Berlin and proclaim a national dictatorship. So Lossow, leader of the Bavarian army, is quite happy to throw in his lot with Hitler, joining with Hitler and march north on Berlin. But of course Lossow's boss, his commander-in-chief, the commander-in-chief of the army in Berlin, is of course Seeckt. And Seeckt then blew cold on the idea. Okay, and effectively gave a very clear instruction on the 8th of November 1923 that the Bavarian army must stand away from Hitler and not back any attempt by Hitler to march on Berlin. As a result, on that evening of the 8th of November, Hitler was, quote Kershaw, pushed into a corner and had no choice but to act or see his support drain away. What Hitler had done is he drummed up amongst the paramilitary groups, particularly the SA, a sort of sense of anticipation. We are going to now march north on Berlin, and Hitler believed that the local Bavarian authorities, Kahr, the leader of the government, Seisser, the leader of the police, and in particular Lossow, the leader of the Bavarian army, were going to march with him. But now there's suddenly a clear message from Siecht in Berlin, who Hitler was expecting, to order the army to stand with him. Siecht has suddenly sent an order to the local Bavarian commander: step down. Your job is not to join Hitler, your job is to stop Hitler. So as a result, on the morning of the 9th of November, Hitler pushed ahead with the proposed march, but the Bavarian army, led by Lossow, stood in Hitler's and Ludendorff's way, and so they never even got out of Munich. The Putschs, as we know, were round up. The ringleaders, including Hitler, were given lenient sentences. So, the survival of democracy. The extremist right had proved to be as divided as the extreme left, and as a result, democracy survived. The right fragmented, the crisis subsided, the currency was stabilised, the Dawes Plan opened the way for economic and political recovery, the so-called Stresemann era. In contrast to Italy, where democracy failed to survive the post-war crisis 1919 to 22, democracy survived in Germany. Okay, so whatever way you look at it, there was enough well-organised support in Germany. The Social Democrats were in power. The Catholic Centre Party and the left liberals, in the end, were able to rally support to defend the Republic. Okay, the German army stood with them. Kershaw makes the point that in contrast to Italy, political participation was more deep-rooted in Germany. For example, that had half a century of universal male suffrage. Also in contrast to Italy, Germany had a strong federal system, and although we can become very preoccupied with Bavaria as the stronghold of opposition to Berlin, remember the state of Prussia, by far the largest state, was controlled by loyal pro-democratic parties. The Prussian state government was controlled by the Social Democrats. But democracy only just survived in Germany. Kershaw makes the point that none of the above would have been enough to save democracy had the power elites turned their backs on it. And so the attitude of the army, especially Siecht in 1923, was the crucial factor that determined the survival of the Republic. In Italy, Mussolini achieved power in 1922 because he had the backing of the Italian army. Hitler, in the end, did not achieve power because he did not have the backing of the German army. But the German army very nearly gave their support to Hitler. The local army commander, Lossow, had wanted to support Hitler, but it was the attitude of the national army leader, Siecht, that in the end saved the Republic. His attitude, though, was very, very ambiguous. On this occasion, the national military leadership in Germany, although sympathetic to what Hitler wanted to do, quote, plainly had serious doubts about the Putsch's chance of success. And this final section of Kershaw is excellent because it kind of like it gets inside Siecht's mind and asks, why didn't he back Hitler? If he was that sympathetic, why did he stand in the way? Well, clearly in Siecht's mind there were memories of the failure of the Kapp Putsch. He was also very worried about what would actually happen if the Putsch succeeded and the military, the German army, found itself leading a new authoritarian national government. What would happen if the Berlin government had been overthrown? Then he, the leader of the army, would have to take on political responsibility in a new right-wing dictatorship. A right-wing dictatorship following a successful putsch, this is a quote from Kershaw, would have been from the outset in a precarious military and economic position. It's doubtful whether the Americans would have gone ahead, for example, with giving Germany economic aid if Germany had been run by a military dictatorship. What then would have happened? If Germany had been run by a military dictatorship, they would not have had the aid, they would have continued to default on reparations. It is likely that there would have been further French intervention. The German army would have been in no position to offer armed resistance. The French could have completely seized the whole of the Rhineland, for example. So Siegt was sufficiently pragmatic, commonsensical in his approach to realise that an attempt to overthrow the government in Berlin was premature, and that the army, although it was sympathised with the motives, it could have made the situation worse. The time was not right to support Hitler yet. Okay, so the Republic held on just. It was safer for the German army leadership, conclusion here, to allow the Republic to continue in the short term. Nice little quote at the end. Without army support, the extreme nationalist right in Germany had no possibility of emulating the rise of fascism to power that had taken place in Italy the previous year. The danger to democracy passed, but the threat had only subsided, not disappeared. Okay, hopefully that was useful to you. Thank you.